so you have this. Now I'm trying to
I
get...
like how you highlight, because I didn't think of it as an image of him going up to him with an empty bowl, asking Joshu, the question that he's like, have you eaten your rice porridge?
So rice is the plain old staple. Everyone knows about it. No one necessarily likes it, but it's the food of the gods.
Welcome to Not Zen, where we talk about Zen, what's not, and occasionally even we'll get to what is not. That's when it really gets fun. Nice and spicy, nice and hot. I give it all I got. Anyway, wait, I don't need a rap right now. Today on the cast, we have Dan. Dan, go ahead and say something cool.
I'm Rapping Dan, and I'm here to say Linji's blind ass is about to turn me enlightened.
Wow, it's not that kind of cast.
Oh, it's not Zen. It's not Zen enlightenment mode.
My name's Brian, second in command today. And way down at the bottom, manning the galley, we have Micah.
I just
Micah
want to
himself.
say, I have personally seen Linji's ass, and that shit is, I mean, it might leave you blind, I guess, looking at it because of just how nice and juicy it is. This is Micah.
It's so shiny. It's so bright.
Right, it's got that Medusa effect.
Blinding ass.
So what is being referenced is the case today. Hi, everyone. How are you doing?
Hi, new listeners.
Hi. Hello. Welcome. The case today is called Linji's Blind Ass. And we get it from the Book of Serenity, which is a classic collection of koans by a Zen master with commentary by the Zen master as well. There's a poem in there by a Zen master and then commentary on the poem. But it's one of the original reliable sources we have about Zen from medieval China.
This is compiled in 1223 by Tiantong and Wansong. Another name for Tiantong is Hongji. I'm looking at that. And
can you name me a more iconic duo?
That's so true. I mean, Yan Wu and Zui Dao are definitely close, but these guys really kill it together.
That's a good point.
This case is called Linji's Blind Ass, which I think is in reference to the donkey, despite what my co-hosts have indicated it to be. Linji's blind ass. So that's why the vulgarity at the beginning of our voyage here. Someone is going to read the case. Let's see. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Catch a tiger by his toe. If you
I believe Micah, you chose this case.
Okay, we'll go with Micah. I don't know. Interrupted.
I did partially choose this case. I like to think that nobody interrupted Brian because he was going to land on me anyways.
The verse has something about tigers in it, so I was quickly formulating some sort of Zen pun.
All right, so this is case 13 of the Book of Serenity, or the Shoyo Roku, if you prefer.
Whoa, that's cool.
Well, are we not going to give the full title?
I mean, if you want to give the full title, is Wansong Lao Ren Ping Chang Tiantong Ju Hishang Songgu Kongruang Anlu, which translates to Old Man Wansong's evaluations of Tiantong Jue's versed comments on old cases. That
is what it is.
For anybody who's wondering, I will add that if you go back and you look at the original titles of any of these books that we read, they all have titles like that. They're kind of systematically titled, actually, and the kind of cool, catchy titles that we use now are not the original Chinese titlings. But I like Book of Serenity. It definitely rolls off the tongue a little easier.
We should add that this is the Book of Equanimity. If you might have heard it that way, so if you have ever been in a Zendo,
I've heard it a few different. Yeah, I've heard a few different.
Same book, different translation.
It's a different. Yeah, it's a different name for it.
I prefer Serenity just because I feel like all else equal, it's just a more English word.
It's very
I don't think
serene.
equanimity is very frequently used.
Only in kind of Buddhist
Yeah, I was
instances.
gonna say that. I was gonna say in a lot of Buddhist circles they
Yeah.
use that word a lot. And I think it actually helps to Book of Serenity helps to differentiate, because I do think that the meaning of the word here is different than it is in a lot of Buddhist circles. But all right, I'm gonna get on with it. I'm gonna read this case. So this is case 13, Book of Serenity, and this is Thomas Cleary's translation. Love you, man. Come on our cast. When Linji was about to die, he admonished Sansheng, "After I pass on, don't destroy my treasury of the Eye of Truth." Sansheng said, "How dare I destroy the teacher's treasury of the Eye of Truth?" Linji said, "If someone suddenly questions you about it, how will you reply?" Sansheng immediately shouted. Linji said, "Who would have known that my treasury of the Eye of Truth would perish in this blind ass?" And that's the case.
Linji's death. Wow, death scene.
Right.
Cool.
Right.
They had a thing, right? They had like a weird like game they would play where they would try to guess exactly when they would die. I think that was the thing. I think Mazu did it too.
Yeah, that's like one of the few sort of quote unquote supernatural kind of occurrences that's hinted at anywhere in these books that I've seen is Mazu specifically. I can't remember if it's his own death or somebody else's death that he predicts or is said to have predicted, which is a funny like thing given all of the like really mystical and out there traits and powers that are given to Buddhas and the Buddhist traditions and schools that exist. It's pretty funny by comparison if your only power is like to predict your own death or something.
What if it was like a comedic trope?
Yeah, I mean that makes sense.
I like the idea that it was like a YOLO they would do, and then just later on people assumed that it was more serious than it was, so they started being like they started having them accurately do it.
It's like, today I was just talking to you guys and a couple of other people who are on this cast, and Kevin, who's often on here, said, you guys, we got to take polls on who's going to win this election, because for listeners who are listening to this after we've recorded it, today we're recording on Monday, November 2nd. I know that kind of gives it away. We don't usually say when we record these, but this is the day before the U.S. presidential election, 2020.
That's right. And, that's right, listeners, the 2028 presidential election.
And Kevin was saying, you guys, we got to put in our calculated guesses for who's going to win this. And it'd be pretty funny if somebody went back afterwards and took those clearly blind guesses to mean like one of us had accurately predicted the election, and because of that we were like, had some kind of psychic power or something. That's a pretty funny thought.
I mean, I assume it's a giveaway that Kanye is going to win. I assume everyone knew that. All right, so we have Linji. Regardless of whether he Babe Ruthed it, pointing to the sands, being like, "Yeah, I'm about to die." Regardless of whether he called it or not, I guess he knows he's dying. It says he admonished Sansheng, "After I pass on, don't destroy my treasury of the Eye of Truth." What a mouthful. What if that's what he used the last of his oxygen to say? Then Sansheng said, how dare I destroy my teacher's treasury of the Eye of Truth? And Cleary's like a pretty like legit translator in terms of like knowing how people speak in English. And it's interesting that he translates this as "how dare I destroy," like as a question, and not "how would I?" How would I dare to, etc. It kind of adds a certain amount of intensity to it.
Well, and Linji's response to that question is interesting, because Sansheng says, "How dare I destroy the teacher's treasury of the Eye of Truth?" And Linji says, "If someone suddenly questions you about it, how will you reply?" As if to imply that his answer to somebody else asking about Linji's treasury of the Eye of Truth will determine whether or not he destroys that Eye of Truth. Which, I don't know, is that true or not?
Well, it's also fun, Linji's kind of catchphrase. There's a meme that they talk about the staff of Deshan, the shout of Linji, right? So he has a meme of shouting like that. His catchphrase is and so there's one cute way where we could do it, where it's like, if somebody asks you about, what was his name? The did I do that guy?
Oh, Steve Urkel?
Yeah, Urkel. Like, what is the treasury of the true eye of Urkel? And then I just say, did I do that? Just kind of like repeating his catchphrase. That's one funny way we can take it. If it's like, oh yeah, this is how Linji was, which if he is being sassy like that, then Linji's response does kind of jive, where he's like, who would have known that my treasury of Eye of Truth would perish in this blind ass? Like, oh no, I've left it with you. If somebody questions you about it, how will you reply? There's a question there. What does he mean when Linji asks him this? If somebody suddenly questions you about it, how will you reply? I don't know what the it there is necessarily referring to. Is he saying if somebody questions you about how would one destroy the teacher's treasury?
It seems to me more like my first read would be how if someone questions you about my treasury of the Eye of Truth, or the treasury of my Eye of Truth. I don't know which one of those is correct, but
well, it's cool the wording. He doesn't say don't destroy my Eye of Truth, right? And we've seen this before. He specifies a vessel. There's a treasury. There's a container of the Eye of Truth. Don't destroy my container of the Eye of Truth. Now, I wonder if there's a pun there in the blind ass. Who would have known my treasury of the Eye of Truth would perish in this blind ass? And so in the translation, so same diff. In translation of the case, we get when Linji was about to die, he admonished Sansheng. So it suggests that like he's already given him a hard time. Linji is the Zen. For listeners, Linji is the older Zen master. We can infer that because he's about to die. However, sometimes people die young. Very sad. He's admonishing his student Sansheng. And then, the very first line of the commentary by Wansong, Linji admonished Sansheng. This is the same kind of action when Xinghua told Superintendent Kepin, before long you'll be the teacher of the way, and expelled him from the monastery as punishment for making a rich soup rice. So Linji's like, this is very similar to when this one Zen master said to this guy, before long you'll be a teacher of the way, and then kicked him out. Which, maybe there's one way we can take it where it's like I looked at the baby bird and I said, very soon you'll be able to fly, and I push it out. Or there's another way where the joke is my physics professor told me I had so much potential, then pushed me off the cliff. It's a little physics student joke.
Blind ass. So if we can kind of figure out that wordplay, I think. So because in the introduction, he talks about not seeing or not knowing that there are people, which covers.
I was just looking at that.
Which covers the blind.
It's the first time I've seen it so explicitly stated.
Yeah. And then you have the ass part of it, which is like the donkey, which just plods along anyway. Right. So even though there are no people blind, you exert the law to the fullest and don't concern yourself that there are no people. So that's the ass part of that. Blind ass. Don't see the people. Don't care about not seeing the people. Anyway.
Kind of goes with the not dwelling that we talked about in a previous episode by Zhang's phases. Don't sit there focusing on that.
Yeah, kind of a common trope. And I wonder if blind ass is just, a really fun way to put that into 2 words. Also have it be admonishing. and fun.
To go on a mini meta rant about Zen memes for a second. I've always found it kind of confusing how Zen masters will use the phrase like seeing without seeing or non-seeing or things like that, to hint at. I'm gonna use the phrase like um, a positive activity, like an activity that they encourage, maybe is a better way to put it. Obviously, I don't think that there are like positives and negatives in Zen in an absolute sense, but I think that
Something enlightened people.
yeah, and I think that there's this other trope of like blindness and deafness and things that comes up, and it doesn't seem to be the same. And it's kind of hard for me to tell sometimes when like they're using which one and what they each mean, and sort of this is a nitty gritty enough thing that it's hard for me to tell sort of what about this trope is something lost in translation, literally, right? That it's something that is sort of I feel this way because I've seen things translated multiple ways that ultimately are not as confusing in the source text. But I think like when he says blind ass, is he mean that in a complimentary way? You know, it's hard for me to even know.
This is kind of an important question. So you have the idea of an idiom, right? Something that makes sense in a culture which doesn't directly translate, like kicking the bucket, right? We understand what it means, but if you took it to another culture, it would be very hard for them to make that connection.
I actually just saw a meme that was just it was just a panel of a dude like with his friend, and in front of one guy was a bucket on the ground and he kicks it, and the other friend is like no, and then the other guy like immediately dies. Pretty funny.
Okay. I think I saw that one too. Maybe you posted it. And that's a thing. And that's a thing that people bring up. It's an annoying thing to bring up because Zen also has its own idioms, which I think is where most of the confusion comes from. But then people just hand wave it away and say, oh, it's a cultural thing. But, you read the Zen stuff and along with, so Zen contained with it in its own language, self-referential to the extreme, right? Even in these two, it's extremely poetic. And actually, we're going to talk about the poem and the commentary later and talk about some of the tricks that are going on in there that I noticed, which are self-referential and allusions, right? Self-allusions like to the poem, and the next line is a allusion to the first, etc. But yeah, so this exists big time within the Zen writings, like big time. And I think often people mistake that for like this weird so you read it, this thing sounds weird, I don't know what it is, it must be a cultural thing. And then it's also a way to assert authority, right? What's the great way to keep your religion mysterious is to talk about how some of the words are untranslatable, or in this case, you can't understand it unless you have this level of learnedness. And you go in, we can get even a step further and talk about, many people who might claim that level of certainty is not knowable within a culture, right? But thank God we don't have to worry about that here because they're nearly all self-referential. And it's the same idea with a translator. We have the Blue Cliff Record, which is hundreds of thousands of words in a huge book. It's like 4 inches thick. The translator can mess up a goddamn word and it's going to be repeated hundreds of times. The same idea is flipped around and moved around and mangled around, and it's in the book just a plethora of times.
And across translations as well.
And then if you have 2 translators doing that, done. You got it. You're good. There's lots of fun stuff to dig into translate. And I'm not like giving a blanket like, these idioms and these translation problems, like it's an excuse to just take what the translator's saying as blind faith. But a good read of the text from the amount of translations we have right now will give you a good idea of what the Zen masters or how the Zen masters are talking.
Yeah, and I think that's something you see a lot within like religious traditions. You see people treating people who are native English speakers, monolingual English speakers, treating the word of a single translation of the Bible that they grew up reading as the testament of God themselves. And I think that is it doesn't acknowledge just the very basic, bare bones facts about what it takes to produce a text like that. That a text like that has moved through almost every human language, and it is just not. It is not the same object as a a Hebrew scroll. And I think that the people bring that same kind of I don't even know, orthodox attitude to Zen in different ways, and I think different institutions reify ideas of things like that. For example, anybody who out there who's been in sort of quote unquote Zen Buddhist spaces, traditionally, a lot of times they will present things like, which is it? The first case of the Mumonkan, that's the Joshu case, the dog case. And that case involves somebody asking Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu saying no. And the majority of Buddhist teachers and as well as translators out there who will religiously affiliated translators who will touch this text will say that well, traditionally they don't translate the word no as no. They leave it as Chinese character or the English transliteration of a Chinese character without translating the word because of some sense of religious obligation to the exact sort of phonetic utterance of this ancient person who would have presumably despised the idea of people being that attached to his exact phonetic utterances. And I think that it can create a lot of meaning in a place where there's not necessarily a lot of meaning to be found without its kind of artificial synthesis. And so I think it's really interesting when we have any kind of case where we have the ability to, and this is why we look at different translations, right? This is why we cross-reference translations on this podcast, is because we are not interested in abiding. I'll speak for myself. I'm not interested in abiding by any one person's idea of how something should be translated. I'm much more interested in the broader stroke ideas that are presented in these texts. And I think that that's something that's different about, what's required of you to approach a religious tome as opposed to one of these Zen books.
Okay, back to the case. What were we talking about? Blind ass. So we were just kind of skipping around, right?
Yeah, I think if I read this case again, would somebody do the notes?
I'm sure someone will. You maybe just go for it and try it.
Okay. All right. This is case 13.
Let's let the listener know real quick what we mean by the notes for the new listeners who stuck it through us, starting off what seemed sexual, but most certainly was contextual. So the guy who wrote the commentary, he also writes little notes, kind of like little footnotes or annotations, maybe between each line, for all intents and purposes, between each line of the case itself. He does the same thing with the poem. And so it's a fun game to play where you read the case and then you read the case and the notes. You read a line, then you read that note, and it's cool. You get like this almost like a director's commentary kind of vibe. All right, yeah, so I'll read the notes. Micah, if you read the what's it called? The case?
Sounds good. So this is case 13 of the Book of Serenity again, Cleary's translation, with is this Tiantong's notes?
So Tiantong compiled it. Tiantong wrote the poem, but we'll get to that when we do the poem. So the notes are all Wansong.
Okay. When Linji was about to die, he admonished Sansheng. I'm going to start over. Let's do it again. When Linji was about to die, he admonished Sansheng.
Kindly as he faces death, he leaves thrice.
After I pass on, don't destroy my treasury of the Eye of Truth.
What's the mortal hurry?
Sansheng said, how dare I destroy the teacher's treasury of the Eye of Truth?
He feigns a small heart, but sure has a lot of guts.
Linji said, if someone suddenly questions you about it, how will you reply?
He lays his body in the tiger's mouth.
Sansheng immediately shouted.
Taking charge of the situation, he doesn't defer to his father.
Linji said, who would have known that my treasury of the Eye of Truth would perish in this blind ass?
Where there's been a great reward given, there must be a brave man. I love that. It's like, is Wansong scolding the guy? Is Linji scolding the guy? Or did the guy play it well? Right? And, in a way, we kind of have to not worry about either of their treasury of the true Eye of Truth to say so.
We've talked on this podcast before about how, there's this idea of living words, and of sort of that when you just repeat words that you've heard somebody else say, it doesn't make it mean the same thing. If you speak words insincerely or just out of a sense of obligation to repetition or regurgitation, that doesn't mean that you are producing any kind of wise or profound thing. As a matter of fact, appropriateness is valued far beyond any kind of apparent wiseness or profoundness. And I think this is the second example I can think of in this case. The first example being the case of Ryutan dying and saying, I took one finger Zen from my teacher and I never exhausted it. Where you have...
I'm not trying to be pedantic, just in case people are looking for episodes on it. That was Guitai.
Oh yeah, wait, his teacher, right, is the one that's Ryutan, or am I wrong? No.
Teacher was Tenru.
Tenru, yeah, okay, that's the name I was thinking of. He says, I took one finger Zen from Tenru and I've never exhausted it, which I think to me intuitively goes against my idea of, sort of it not being very virtuous within Zen to just sort of repurpose somebody else's teaching method without it being authentic. And then in this case, you have Sansheng shouting when Linji asks, how will you reply when somebody questions you about my treasury of the Eye of Truth? Which you already mentioned, Dan. Linji is known for this shout. That's Linji's thing. And so when Sansheng shouts like that, it to me almost just feels like he's just regurgitating or performing Linji's teaching method. But I think that is, I think just like in the Gutai case, there is then something to be said for what does it mean to steal something honestly, or to steal something with what's different about stealing something and it being living words and an appropriate statement versus stealing something and it not being.
Well, it's cool. We get the note after Linji's question. We get the note on Linji's question being, he lays his body in the tiger's mouth. And then after the shout, the note Wansong writes is, taking charge of the situation, he doesn't defer to his father. He doesn't defer, which is real cute, especially in a Confucian society where filial piety is a big game. He's taking charge of the situation. He doesn't defer to Linji, which is pretty great, and Linji's probably pretty happy about that. And there's a saying in Zen that each generation must surpass the previous lest the tradition die out, which has layers, lots and lots of layers to it. and listener, basically, you must surpass every previous generation of Zen lest it die out. And the commentary plays with this. I might be exposing some of what I'm thinking of when I say layers, but or pardon me, the pointer to this case. So again, for more vocabulary for new listeners, we got a pointer at the beginning of the case, which is again Wansong. Pretty much everything except the poem is Wansong, and he writes that as a kind of a foreshadowing of the case. But again, typically it's a fun game to read the case first, then read the commentary, then read the pointer. But it's a game. You can play the way you want. So I'll just go ahead and read the pointer. And Brian mentioned a piece of it earlier on, and this is one of the most explicit times I've seen it said in any of these. But so it goes as this, and this is the pointer of the 13th case of the Book of Serenity, translated by Thomas Cleary, and it goes as follows. Devoted entirely to helping others, you don't know there is a self. You should exert the law to the fullest, without concern that there be no people. For that, it is necessary to have the ruthless ability to snap a wooden pillar in two. When about to go, what then? So we get two. There's like a first and second half to this, right? There's here's some stuff, and then you get like, okay, well, now what are you going to do with it? Which is pretty common for Zen. Typically, there's not necessarily even a call to action, a question to action that a lot of Zen cases and commentaries end with. But we get two things in the first part, at least. You don't know there is self. And what's cool there is it doesn't say that there is no self, as much as people who are lonely want to say that there isn't. You don't know there is self. You're not focused on it. Devoted entirely to helping others, you don't know there is self. You should exert the law to the fullest. And what is the law, right? The law is social contract to keep coherence. Without concern that there be no people. So you're not worried about that jazz. When you think Huangbo's infamous compassion is not conceiving of sentient beings to be saved, you can be like, okay, yeah, it's not conceiving of sentient beings at all to be saved, right? And it's like, well, yeah, that's cute, but like, you're not concerned about that aspect of it.
Or even more explicitly, I think when people like, I don't know, maybe this is Huangbo or Foyan who say, like, I think Huangbo, all is mind. There is nothing but one mind. And I think that then we've talked about that before on this podcast. I think it's really easy for people to lapse into solipsism and to explicitly to be thinking like, okay, well, that means other people just don't exist. Other people, not only do I not need to be accountable to them, but I can't even account for like their existence in terms of what I can rely on in this world, which is just, it's false. That's a,
yeah. If you're not careful, you end up Dostoevsky. Right. Or you end up Breakfast of Champions.
Or just a fucking loner, Nobody wants that.
Mm-hmm. And so, are there other people? It's a valid question to ask at a certain point in Zen. But after a while, it stops being an interesting question. And it's not exactly identical, but, I've used this before as an analogy to other things on the cast, but I'll use it again for this. It's valid for a freshman philosophy major to ask, is a hot dog a sandwich? But by the time they're a senior and you ask them that question, I hope that they're at a point where they're like, well, like, do you call it a sandwich? Whatever. But the without concern for people, you must be able to snap a wooden pillar in two. So Sansheng understands that he can't touch Linji's treasury of the Eye of Truth. It's Linji's. Sansheng can't touch it because it's Linji's. So how would I even? Then Linji does that, and then Sansheng does something incredibly romantic and, repeats the catchphrase to him. And then Linji is like, playing along. Who would have known that my treasury of the Eye of Truth would perish in this blind ass? this guy who isn't conceiving of other people and yet still moves forward, still takes charge. Even when he has people in the tiger's jaws. And I've been waiting for an interesting opportunity to bring this up, so I'll do it now. What's fun is Sansheng is the guy who compiled Linji's words. Now we can imagine that a lot of monks wrote down like noticeable exchanges from Linji, but Sansheng is credited to be the guy who compiled Linji's words into the record of Linji. So this case was likely written down by Sansheng himself, which is really funny. Now it was compiled, like it was decided to put into this by Zen Master Tiantong, right? But that's from a collection of, all these sayings and cases that were, known and compiled at the time. Because this, came out like 1200 or whatnot. But, the Linji, in Sansheng's life, he was born 830 AD to 900 AD, or CE for my my communists out there. And I needed to pick a C word. I'm trying to switch it up from Christians. That way it's a different, helps you remember which episode was what. For my Chinese out there. But so that's really fun. But he put down his own little admonishment. So I read earlier, comparing it to the guy who's like, before long you'll be a teacher of the way, and then expelled him from the monastery because he made rich soup rice, which I assume means like it was too sweet or it was too good or whatever. But the very next part says, in reality, this thing does not increase. What thing? This thing. This treasury of the eye of the very truth. In reality, this thing does not increase even 1,000 Buddhas. Pardon me. This thing does not increase even though 1,000 Buddhas appear in the world, nor does it decrease when 1,000 sages pass away. Right? So it doesn't increase or decrease regardless of what you might expect. 1,000 Buddhas appearing in the world doesn't increase the eye of truth, the treasury of the eye of truth. And then Wansong goes on to say, given this, that's my summary, how could one Sansheng be able to cause it to prosper or die out? So how could Sansheng cause it to prosper or die out? Kind of referencing how Linji says, who would have known that my treasury of the eye of truth would perish in this blind ass?
Right. So, this begets the joke, right? So if suddenly someone questions about it, how will you reply? Sangshug ironically does a copy, right? Because why, in this case, why not do the affectionate thing to Linji on his deathbed? Join in on the joke, to show that, it can't be, what is the wording there? Increased or decreased. And Linji also follows with, as you said, as Dan said, who would have known that the treasure of the true eye of the truth would perish or could be decreased. Right, so and it brings us back to the introduction again in another sort of way. If you're, let's really switch the words around. If your core being couldn't be increased or decreased, then what does that free you up to do? Whatever. And what are you going to do? You're going to probably be joking around and playing around with increase and decrease with the people who also have no attachment to things increasing or decreasing.
It's almost like tickling. Like tickling is so interesting because you're touching, and it goes beyond just humans. Like there's a fun thing where they found that if you like grad students working with rats for bio or whatever. If you tickle the rats when you're a new lab assistant, then they'll come over and work with you later more easily. And kids love to be tickled, but like at the same time you fight the tickling, and it's fascinating. And so if you think about it, when you tickle, you're touching the parts of the body that are extremely vulnerable. If you think about all the spots where people are ticklish, under the arms, stuff like that, there's not like your breastplate protecting you or things like that. Typically it's under joints and stuff like that. So he says, where if I was a carnivore and that was my mouth and I was trying to eat you, it would be the worst spot for you for that to be. So tickling, you're touching these places, but then you take your hand away. And it's like this interesting thing of like, oh no, I'm going to be harmed. Oh wait, I'm not. And you're just kind of like reinforcing this habit of, but I'm not harming you. And then the brain's like, oh, and that's nice. This is a person who's not going to harm me.
Repeated relief. Kind of like peekaboo with a kid, right? Where I think the reason peekaboo works is because they don't have any object permanence. So like when you hide your face, they think that you disappeared, that you don't exist anymore. And then when you show your face again, they feel that relief of like, oh, this familiar person is still there. They still exist.
And this is a thing.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess eventually, they're like, this is a thing. And so it's almost like tickling where, they bring up they play with these concepts that they know aren't things. And it's like, oh yeah, I forgot that people thought that was a thing. and what's cool is, the whole time they're not worried about what is the articulation of the self. They're not worried about, okay, are there other people? They're just like, okay, yeah, you're my Zen master and I'm going to goof with you.
Well, and I think the line is explained even more in the commentary with the sentence which follows what was just read from the commentary. The ancient demonstrated this thing, referencing Sansheng, and also showed that there was someone in the congregation.
Yeah.
Right, so he demonstrated the thing, take that as you will, and also showed that someone was there, when he shouted.
Also, that somebody had been paying attention to Linji and knew that Linji had a thing.
Yeah.
And, we can imagine this was very emotional for both of them. I mean, this guy is the guy who compiled Linji's teachings and stuff. We can imagine him being there for a while with Linji, and he clearly cared a lot about, what I'll call a Zen professor said. And so, we can imagine this being a very two people very close to each other when one is on their deathbed. It's really sweet. It's really sweet in a way.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, Linji has really dedicated his life to this kind of discourse, or that this tickling that you're talking about, and I think that it may feel like tickling when it's between these two enlightened folks, but I think that tickling takes on many different forms that maybe are less enjoyable for participants when you're looking at cases where it's like a monk who's really desperate for answers or something like that, And I think that Linji's clearly dedicated his life to this, and then on his deathbed, I do think it's pretty sweet to have this. It's like it's like you're sitting there on your deathbed, and your friend who you've gone to every local football game with for the last 10 years, and you've been buying season tickets together, every year for the last decade, and you're sitting there and you're talking about last night's game as you're in your last couple of hours of life. I think that that's a very, very sweet moment.
Yeah, what do they say? Your second best friend when when you need bail and you're in jail. They're like, "Oh, I got you. I'm coming to get you." And your best friend is next to you in the cell.
Right.
Now, in this case, which was Sansheng? Was Sansheng the one in the cell with Linji? Or was Sansheng the one coming to get him? Or saying, man, you'll be all right. It's going to be all right. You can handle some jail.
Want to read the verse? Poem?
I want to read one more line after after the part of the commentary you wrote, or that I mean, reading is writing, right? Referencing when Sansheng comes out and says, "How dare I destroy the teacher's treasury of the Eye of Truth?" Wansong says, "It was like one who did not accept another's revilement, immediately offering his own provisions." Like, so like if you get like mad at me or whatever for doing a thing, but I'm like, whatever, immediately offering his own provisions. The treasury of the Eye of Truth has not become extinct. It didn't actually perish. Then, referencing Linji's response, if somebody questions you about it, what will you reply? Wansong says, "When you don't stop what should be stopped, instead you bring about disorder." Sansheng immediately shouted. In high antiquity and later times, appearing within this gate, since Bai Zhang was deafened for 3 days by Mazu's shout, that's just a reference to an earlier thing that happened, none have compared to this shout of Sansheng. He's saying this shout is like the most epic thing since the epic story where Zen Master Mazu deafened Bai Zhang for 3 days because of his mighty shout. So we see some admiration in the shout, even after we read the note where it's like, well, he certainly has guts. But yeah, then the very next, 2 sentences later, it says, "I don't know how Tiantong will finally judge," and that leads us into the poem, which I really like about Book of Serenity. It's like a really nice, like when the singer's like, like Red Hot Chili Peppers, and he's like, "Take it, Johnny," and then the guitarist does his solo. There's this cool, he throws it to Tiantong. And next comes the poem that we're about to read. Micah, do you want to read the poem? You did a wonderful job reading the case.
I would love
That is
to.
not a please read the poem. That is an actual question.
I would love to read the poem. This is Tiantong's verse on the 13th case of the Book of Serenity. The robe of faith is imparted at midnight to Huineng, stirring up the 700 monks at Huangmai. The eye of truth of the branch of Linji. The blind ass, destroying it, gets the hatred of others. Mind to mind, they seal each other. Patriarch to patriarch, they pass on a lamp. Leveling oceans and mountains, magically producing a rock. Just the name and word is hard to compare. In sum, the method is knowing how to fly.
There's a few references probably useful to go, and so let's start. Well, real quick, I'll just say, magically producing a rock. Listener, it's spelled ROC. Basically, think like giant bird, like bird version of dragon. But anyways, we can get to that. The first line, the robe of faith is imparted at midnight to Huineng. So Huineng is the 6th patriarch. There's a real fun, like, Goodwill Hunting story with him, where there's the 5th patriarch of Zen. This is before Mazu, back when there was like okay, this is like the main guy, then this is the main guy, right? The 5th one, he's like, all right, I'm going to appoint my official successor. And he puts out a poetry contest, and one guy does it. Then there's Swinning, who is basically the janitor. Sees the math equation outside, sees the one student's answer, sees the guy's poem, and then corrects it and writes his own poem better. Well, doesn't even write it, because I think he was illiterate, so he recites it later after the guy says his poem. And then 5th patriarch's like, oh, yo, that's what's up.
No,
so he makes him that.
He has somebody else write it, which is even funnier.
Oh, is that what it was? Okay.
He has a different monk write it up for him. He dictates it to another guy.
Yeah, because then the 5th patriarch was like, I know it was you, buddy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And yeah, so there's this idea of the bowl and the robes. Supposedly of Bodhidharma, the 1st patriarch of Zen, the guy who brought Zen, quote unquote, to China from India. Many people ask why, or what the meaning of it was. But anyway, so there's this robe of faith is imparted at midnight to Huineng. The idea there is that the 5th patriarch gave that to Huineng, according to the legend, in the middle of the night because he was worried everybody would be pissed, and tell Huineng to run, stirring up the 700 monks at Huangmei, and I assume Huangmei is the temple they were at.
Yeah, and the reason for that is that the other guy who Huineng's poem was in response to, if you read the two poems, his poem is directly in response to the poem of another guy who had been trained for years at that point to take over this position. And everybody assumed it was going to be him. He was being groomed for this role as far as people were concerned. But then Huineng comes along, puts up this baller ass poem that just like shuts down the other guy's poem, and people are pissed. People are like, this is really throwing a wrench into the hierarchical order that we conceive of, this monastery to have, and we're gonna riot about it, and so they go after him.
Well, they're worried about the riot. That people are gonna be pissed. But the story is that the guy whose poem he countered, essentially rap battle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chases him down, and then eventually Huining realizes he's not gonna go away, so he just chills out. And then the guy gets to him, then asks him to teach him, which is real cute. Now we're basically at the point of legend, give or take.
Well, I mean, as we said earlier, we're happy to. I personally am happy to concede all of this as legend. It literally makes no difference whatsoever.
I'm okay just calling it all real.
Yeah,
calling it all literal.
Right.
But yeah, so I think I can see the relation there of, what you expect is going to rowdy people up. One who did not accept another's revilement. Like, I'm not worried if they're going to get pissed. I'm still going to make you the sixth patriarch. And Wansong says, he says, Linji made a clear transmission, but even now some people don't get it. This kind of technique is like a giant fish becoming a rock, mountains and seas being leveled. Again, rock, ROC. And yeah, Brian asked me, wait, did it mention a dragon? And I had the same thought, because there's the Magikarp legend of the carp, one in every 1,000 carp who gets the waterfall becomes a dragon, and Zen masters have used that meme before. In this one, it's like a giant fish becoming a rock. I almost wonder if it's like the same concept and it's just a different a story, used a different vibe of it. But Linji made a clear transmission, but even now some people don't get it. And then he goes on to say, I have no idea how to pronounce this. Huaishu of Dagui said, the ancient waited till death. Why did the treasury of the true eye after all die out in this blind ass? Linji carried out his plan in a hurry, and San Sheng was too hasty. Because of this, the sense of father and son was forgotten, eventually causing people of later times to lose hope. If one doesn't find flowing water, one must go to another mountain. However, in Zen, if Linji dies and Sansheng's like, well, yeah, it's cool because I'm Linji's son and that's why I'm cool, then Linji fucked up. Because Zen is not about any authority to anyone else, particularly from anything outside of yourself, regardless of whether Linji was outside of Sansheng or not. They lift up a staff often in cases where the staff kind of being a symbol for who the Zen master is at the monastery, right? Because like legal reasons or tradition, whatever. And also people want to come ask Zen master questions, so it just became practical for there to be a certain staff. But they hold it up and they're like, if you think this is what it is, then it's off. Like, it's not about authority of who wields the staff. You wield the staff.
Just to wrap up this verse commentary that you were just reading, I am interested in this. Wansong says that he essentially, after the excerpt that you just read, Dan, Wansong says that in the original record of this story, Sansheng bows at the end, and then Linji says a poem to him, and then immediately after that poem, he dies. And Wansong specifically notes that Tiantong, he says, Tiantong brings this case right up to the good part, then stops. Sansheng bowed. Linji spoke a verse. This is real letting go of an easy dismissal here. Is there anyone who can show some spirit for the ancients? Dangerous. And I don't quite understand what he means. It's interesting to me when the Zen masters who are commenting on these cases present like further pieces of a story that's being told in the case. It always, because these cases were all pulled from all these books. They were all pulled from other either other compendiums, often with longer stories, or they were recorded from exchanges, which, the exchange, I'm assuming in general, these exchanges were not limited to the 2 sentences that are reproduced in these cases. And I often, it's interesting to see what other stuff, what other context is available. And when Wansong says that that Tiantong brings this case right up to the good part, then stops, and that this is real letting go of an easy dismissal. I don't know what that means. Is he saying that the easy dismissal is the sort of nicely wrapped bow that is Sansheng bowing and then Linji giving a verse? Is he saying that that's too neat, or is he actually bemoaning the absence of this element in this story, saying that it was better off left in?
Yeah, I think it is a comment on the pedagogy of what's going on here. He brings it right up to the good part, then stops, right? So, and the good part being saying the bowing, and then Linji spoke a verse, which, and we went through this case and kind of looked at it, and I hadn't read this part of the commentary, or I read it, I kind of didn't think about it while I was prepping for the cast today. So we had to bring some spirit, right? So we had to go out with our interpretations and look at this interaction without someone saying whether it was good or bad. And in this case, someone saying whether they, showing that they kind of were friends still, right? Because the case, talks about one admonishing the other, one, kind of seems like they were making fun of each other, or that one was not approved and that maybe they were being mean towards each other. And that's really what the case reads on surface level. If we added in the bowing and the verse, you would do away with the reason why that might be there, at least for Wansong, which would be to show help us show some spirit for the ancients.
And there's some cool meta in that, and we maybe in like 3 sentences, noticed this before we pressed record, listener, where we have Sansheng not worried about his teacher's true eye. And that is kind of a form of respect, right? Because it can't be increased or decreased. And without that, to survive this case, especially if you're looking for, who won and who lost, which in Zen, they'll make fun of you for days for assuming that that's the dichotomy that must be there. It forces you to not accept another's revilement and offering your own provisions, not looking at, okay, Zen master, which one was good, which one was bad, were they being, what was it? You just kind of go with it. And then on the very last page, then you get, oh, by the way, he bowed and there was a romantic ending. And I don't mean romantic, listener, in like the typical sense. I mean in terms of like poetic beauty, right? Very dangerous to have poetic last words. People might misinterpret them.
Yeah, it's very tempting to put the easy dismissal in, and it's very difficult to withhold it, right? Because the easy dismissal is when you if I was bringing up a case and then kind of explicitly told someone what I thought the case was about and set it on paper and printed it for people thousands of years to read later, that would be kind of the natural tendency of humans, basically. right? To live on through that interpretation, right? But giving up that easy dismissal is a little more difficult than something I think we find in Zen all the time. And honestly, this saying this right here is kind of cool, and it can be applied to lots of other, instances in text, even lectures from Zen masters, etc. How many times do you, it can almost be a mantra, right? So how many times do you attach to a certain meme or figure out a certain meme, and now you've or a certain way a Zen master says something, or a certain form of conversation, and you've really kind of set on that, and now using that interpretation to interpret other things, right?
Yeah.
But the Zen master,
we see Zen masters switch it up on purpose,
right?
They say that they switch it up on purpose.
So they have. I mean, this line right here shows a lot about the intent of the authors of the Zen masters, or the Zen masters as authors, and the intent is to not provide those easy dismissals, which kind of can be then furthered into, it's not something that they want you to engage. It's not how they want you to engage in their literature, and assumedly even further than that.
Sure, because even though death is a tragic point in a plot, and is not not by any means typically sort of, death of a protagonist is not typically something that's the most enjoyable element of a plot, but it definitely offers resolution, which in and of itself is an experience when reading or when engaging with a narrative that I think can bring its own sense of sort of something to bite onto, even if it's not something that that maybe produces the positive emotions, right? And so I think depriving the reader of that, in this case in particular, when you're talking about death, which is like, right, the most salient example of tragedy for humans, you end this case. If you just read the case itself, you end the case, and you begin and end this story with a protagonist on their deathbed, but you have none of the resolution of that person dying, or of any sort of situation change occurring over the course of the case itself. And I think that leaving out the bow, that's super interesting to me, right? Because leaving out the part about Linji dying, that makes total sense. But leaving out even the bow, even the death verse, leaving those out so as to not offer any place to hide within this story beyond the words that are said by these masters. It makes a lot of sense to me.
When the sword is used, it should immediately be polished. I mean, I think that's what he said, Linji himself said as part of the poem.
Right.
Yeah. Now that we've talked about the poem, and I like the meta there. We talked about the poem listener without reading the poem,
right,
that Linji gave. How easy was it to let go of an easy dismissal? And I'll just go ahead and read it. And so Linji, famous last words, as My Chemical Romance once wrote. So Linji eventually says, if one asks how it is, along with flow without end, real illumination boundless bespeaks it to him. Apart from names and characterizations, people don't understand. Once the sword is used, it should immediately be polished. Which I'm going to take to be using the sword is polishing it. It is immediately polished.
Fair.
If nobody has any last thoughts, we could use those as our famous last words.
I definitely, through the course of this recording this cast, I have definitely come to take this case more seriously. When Zen masters and translators collectively conspire to use any kind of like surface level vulgar language or anything. It's easy to find that amusing and to let that be, an emotional response to these cases. But in cracking this open, I think, as always, I've come to appreciate it a lot more, and it really is beautiful to imagine this moment, between these two. And especially, I don't know, when I consider, like, for example, traditional accounts of Gautama Buddha's death, where he it's different in the way that it's delivered. It's different in the way that it's viewed. And I think that this experience of it being an interaction between two people is very different from the Buddha being surrounded by people who revere him in a way that is deity-like, And I think that there's a certain friendship that's exemplified here in this case that is, to me, just my gut reaction, feels much more desirable, in terms of I would much rather be in Linji's position and have a close friend at hand making jokes with me, through this experience, than to be, in meditation and drop through the 9 jhanas on my way to Nibbana.
Or even more, people hanging on your every word. Somebody on some podcast, and I haven't looked this up to verify it, but I assume, no, I'm not going to go down that route. But John von Neumann, who was a mathematician of the past century, pretty smart guy, supposedly on his deathbed, there were like 5-star generals there, like, just in case he ended up producing a few solutions to some problems before he died. Right. Now, if you're a mathematician, maybe that's like your
so
vibe.
fucking stressful.
I don't necessarily know if I would dislike that or not, but very different than ideally, I have happy grandchildren surrounding. Well, the way we'll live, probably great grandchildren, right? But
Jesus.
But listeners, when your friends die, what are you going to do? Are you going to give them shit? Are you going to... Can their memory be increased or decreased? Can their soul be harmed? Body can be harmed, clearly. They can die. Can that fundamental being be increased or decreased? Well, according to Wansong, can't be. And so definitely tell us a very heartfelt thought about what you would do if you were in the position of San Sheng in your 5-star review.
Or
if you
write a post on the Not Zen subreddit.
Or write a post on the Not Zen subreddit, which I give a 5-star review to. Great subreddit. Yep. You can probably guess how it's spelled, listeners. Yep. But yeah, hit us up with that 5-star review, because I think we go up in the search ranking. I'm just gonna leave it. Jim's not here, so it's a little less fun to just like ramble on about it if there's not Jim here when he's host, and just slowly gets tired of it.
Right, we enjoy it too much, unabashedly.
Yeah, it's too fun. Yeah, we gotta save it, or else it's not gonna be interesting anymore. But yeah, listeners, you know what to do. And if you do, we'll even give you a shout out. Just like put like a smiley face at the end or something, and we'll give you a shout out. That'll be like our code word, because maybe not everybody wants a shout out, or you can ask us to give a shout out to anybody. We might not. If you ask us to give a shout out to OJ or Hitler, maybe not.
Right.
But
if it's your mom's birthday, hey.
Yeah, if it's your mom's birthday, I will call your mom and sing her happy birthday.
I will do that too. Drop her phone number in the Not Zen sub.
Yeah, that's why we've given their mom's phone number. We went the same way. All right.
Good time, guys.
Any last words?
Mm-hmm.
Any last words, gentlemen?
Oh, What a great cast. Look forward to the next one tomorrow. We do this every day.
We do. Listeners, you have no idea the backlog we got.
Yeah.
Like, we're stocked. Like, if all of us die and we just have this on autopilot, we're good for many years.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thanks.
So true.